Well, hey everybody, I hope you're doing well. We are just a few weeks away from Easter right now, and we're actually in a season in the church calendar known as Lent. Maybe you're familiar with that word, maybe you're not. For me personally, I grew up in church, but the church calendar in general, or Lent specifically, wasn't something that we really ever talked about. But Lent is a 40-day period leading up to Easter that's meant to be a season of reflection and fasting and focus specifically on sin and the cross. So over the next few weeks, we're going to spend some time, along with a lot of other Christians in a lot of different places around the world, reflecting on the cross and ultimately what it shows us about who God is, about who we are, and about what it means for our lives. So listen to this account of the cross from Luke's gospel. It says, when they arrived at the place called the Skull, they crucified him there, along with the criminals, one on the right and one on the left. And then Jesus said, Father, forgive them, because they do not know what they're doing. And they divided his clothes, and they cast lots. The people stood watching, and even the leaders were scoffing. He saved others. Let him save himself, if this is God's Messiah, the chosen one. The soldiers also mocked him, and they came offering him sour wine and said, If you are the King of the Jews, save yourself. An inscription was above him, This is the King of the Jews. And then one of the criminals hanging there began to yell insults at him. Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us. But the other answered, rebuking him, Don't you even fear God, since you are undergoing the same punishment? We are punished justly, because we're getting back what we deserve for the things we did, but this man has done nothing wrong. And then he said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And he, Jesus, said to him, Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise. It was now about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3, because the sun's light failed. The curtain of the sanctuary was split down the middle, and Jesus called out with a loud voice, Father, into your hands I entrust my spirit. And saying this, he breathed his last. One of the things that's so interesting to me about this story is how straightforward and to the point it is. Jesus was led out of the city of Jerusalem, nailed to a cross. Here's what happened while he was on the cross, and then he died. Basically, everyone, whether Christian or not, is familiar with this event of the cross in some way. But the question that we need to be asking is, what is actually happening here? Why is this necessary? Why did that event that we just read about have to happen? If you're going to answer that question, you have to realize that this individual story happens in the middle of a much larger story. I don't know whether you realize it or not, but that's actually what the Bible is. It's a story. There are a lot of individual stories in the Bible, but ultimately it's telling you one single unified story. So trying to understand the cross, which happens about 2/3 of the way through the story, without understanding the rest of the story, it's like trying to read The Return of the King without reading The Fellowship of the Ring and The Two Towers. You might be able to pick up on the general point of the story and the significance of certain characters, but you're going to miss out on the full significance of what the story is trying to teach you. So the story of the Bible starts with God. God creates a good world. He creates human beings to be in relationship with himself, to be his representatives in the world. But what happens really quickly in the story, Genesis 3, is the entrance of sin into the world. And if you're going to understand the significance of the cross, you have to understand the significance of sin in this story. In fact, part of the reason the cross doesn't move us to tears, part of the reason it doesn't fill us with joy could be because we don't take our own sin seriously enough. Listen to what an author named Fleming Rutledge says about sin. She says, let us be quite clear about what sin is. Let us not trivialize it or domesticate it. Sin is not a matter of a few sins here and a few sins there. What is sin? Sin is the basic condition of man, the condition of rebellion against God in his place. It's mankind's essential illness. It's a condition we're all heir to. It's a demonic power that enslaves us and binds us and prevents us from being either free or good. We're responsible before God for sin, and yet we're unable to liberate ourselves from its grip. We're in a desperate situation, deserving of God's wrath, marked out for his judgment, each of us individually and all of us collectively. Indeed, it is only by endeavoring to look sin straight in the face that we're able to understand grace. Sentimental evasions are long-range cruelties. Now, we got 10 minutes together, so we don't have time to unpack all of that or to read every passage, but I'll summarize it this way. God's response to sin is not to leave us, it's to pursue us. The God of the Bible wants to be with his people. So the question that becomes the tension point of the whole Bible is, how can a holy God be with sinful people? And as the story goes on, what you find is that the answer to that question is sacrifice. God comes to a man named Abraham and he tells him he's going to make his family into a great nation. That nation is going to be a blessing to the rest of the nations of the world. Abraham's descendants eventually become the nation of Israel. The nation of Israel ends up enslaved in Egypt. God frees them from that in this event called the Exodus, and he tells them he's going to be their God, that he's going to be with them. But the only way that he's going to be able to make that happen is through this place called the tabernacle. Tabernacle was this tent. It was like the hot spot of God's presence with his people. And in the tabernacle, there were these ritual sacrifices that happened on a daily basis and then once a year on the Day of Atonement as a means of dealing with the sin of the people. This is what the book of Leviticus is all about. Like, if you lied to your neighbor, you would come to the tabernacle, you would bring an animal with you, and the priest would sacrifice that animal on the altar in the tabernacle. Now, maybe you're thinking something like, why couldn't God just say, I forgive you? Why did an innocent animal have to die? It seems like God could have just said, you know what? I love you, so we're good here. Let's just forget about it, act like it never happened. Like, what is up with the sacrifices? Well, first of all, that's just not how forgiveness works. Anytime real forgiveness happens, someone has to take the cost for the wrongdoing on themselves. Like if we go out to coffee and we order our coffee, we get the coffees and we get ready to pay, and I realize that I forgot my wallet, I'd say, oh man, I'm so sorry. But it doesn't do any good if you say, I forgive you, if you don't actually cover the cost of the coffee, right? For forgiveness to happen, my failure has to be covered. But there was also something else happening with these sacrifices where in that imaginary situation where you lied to your neighbor and you take the animal to the tabernacle and the priest sacrifices the animal, as you are watching this animal die, you're being given a living picture of a few different things. Number one, you're being given a living picture of the seriousness of your sin. Like, what I did to my neighbor is serious enough that it has to be covered with another life. Number two, you're being given a living picture of the character of God. You're seeing that God is just, that because he loves his world and because he loves human beings, he hates the things that destroy them. But you're also seeing that God loves you so much that he's unwilling to let sin stop him from being with you. And what happens as the story continues is that the people of Israel fail to live out that calling that God has given them. So you're left to wonder, what is God going to do? How is he going to respond to that continued sin and rebellion of humanity? Well, look at the way that Paul describes this in Romans chapter 3. But now, apart from the law, the righteousness of God has been revealed, attested by the law and the prophets, by the rest of the biblical story. The righteousness of God is through faith in Jesus Christ to all who believe, since there is no distinction. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. They are justified freely by his grace through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus. God presented him as an atoning sacrifice by his blood through faith to demonstrate his righteousness, because in his restraint, God passed over the sins previously committed. God presented him to demonstrate his righteousness at the present time so that he would be both just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. So the answer to the question of why Jesus had to die, based on the whole biblical story, is that your sin leaves you in need of a sacrifice. My sin leaves me in need of a sacrifice. If I'm going to know God and have a relationship with him and live out his purpose for my life and be in his presence, my sin has to be dealt with. And Jesus is the once-for-all sacrifice. So when we look to the cross, we see the seriousness of our sin. There's this old Christian song that says, "It was my sin that held him there until it was accomplished." But it also shows you the character of God, just like the passage that we just read. When you look to the cross, you see a God who's just in his treatment of sin, but also so loving in his treatment of sinners that he's willing to become the sacrifice himself. And because of that, you can be justified. Regardless of your past sin, regardless of your present sin, you can stand before God free from condemnation because Jesus is the sacrifice that covers your sin. My favorite example of this is the thief on the cross in the story we read at the beginning. He's being crucified next to Jesus because he's lived this life of crime. And all he says to Jesus is, hey, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus' response is to say, today you will be with me in paradise. There's a pastor named Alistair Begg who uses this great illustration where he imagines that thief showing up to heaven. Everybody's like, how'd you get here? And he's like, I don't know. Like, what do you mean you don't know? He's like, I genuinely don't know. And they're like, well, like, what do you believe about the Bible? He's like, I don't know. What do you believe about the doctrine of justification by faith? He's like, I don't know. Like, so how did you get here? And he says, all I know is that the man on the middle cross told me I could come. And that's what we're talking about today. Jesus is the sacrifice for your sin. And because of that, you can stand before God free from condemnation. You don't have to earn it. You don't have to strive for it. It's a gift of grace. So whether it's for the first time or the 1,000th time, here's what I want to challenge you to do, to rest in that. We often talk about belief. We talk about trusting in Jesus, and those are biblical words. But one New Testament scholar said the best modern day translation of believe or trust is to relax. You don't have to earn anything. You don't have to strive for anything. You can relax in the fact that your sin has been covered, and because of Jesus' sacrifice, you stand before God free from condemnation. We love you guys. We're praying for you. We're cheering you on as you follow Jesus, and we hope you have a great week.